Convolutional neural networks has been shown to be effective in image classification problems of different domains. However, training these models usually requires a large volume of annotated images. This can make it difficult to apply these methods in domains where it is not feasible to build large training datasets. We can divide a convolutional neural network into a feature extractor and a classifier. In this video, I'll talk about a method that needs a minimum number of images to train CNN's feature extractors. Feature learning from image markers, FLIM, is a method that learns the features from markers drawn on images selected by the model designer, thus allowing more control and understanding of the process. To evaluate the method, we apply it to the problem of classifying images of coconut trees. We compare CNNs with feature structures learned with FLIM with a popular model from the literature. In the rest of the video, I'll give a visual motivation for the method, I'll describe the dataset used, the experiments carried out, and the results obtained. Let's say we have a dataset X and that we have a mechanism phi that turns X into something that has some characteristics that we want. For example, in our classification problem, we want phi of X to have some properties that facilitate the task of discriminate among samples from this dataset. Let's see an example. Let's say you have a problem with two classes, blue points and red points that lie in a 2D space. Here, blue and red points can represent anything, but each sample has two features, which are its coordinates in space. Note that these points are more or less divided in three groups. Note that we are unable to properly separate the group of red points from the groups of blue points using a line. In other words, this problem is not linear separable, but you can do something to turn this problem into a linear separable one. Observe this transformation. We went from a 2D space to a 3D space, and it is now possible to draw a plane that separates the red class from the blue class in an acceptable way. But what transformation was that? Again, we have that two classes are divided into three groups. Note the vectors that points toward the center of these three groups. Observe these planes orthogonal to these vectors. Note that each of these planes somehow separates one class from the others, each group from the others. For the green plane, we need to shift it a bit to find the point at which it best separates those blue points from the rest. To avoid the need to shift the green plane, we can subtract the mean of these points and send them around the origin, and divide by the standard deviation to standardize them. Now look again at the vectors that point to the center of each group. Now, we're going to take the dot product between each of these points and the three vectors. That is, multiply each vector by this matrix. We have a transformation that takes points from 2D space to 3D space. For each point, the three new coordinates are the dot product between the point and each of the three vectors that point to the center of each group. But this transformation alone still doesn't seem to be enough. So, if we zero out the negative values for each point, we will make each group lie into one of the three axes. It is now much easier to draw a plane that separates the red class from the other classes in an acceptable way. This was the transformation that we used to map this nonlinear separable problem to a linear separable one. We built a feature extractor. Note the similarities of this transformation with the convolutional operation normally used in convolutional neural networks. We can see the transformation we made as a convolution, in which the three kernels are the vectors that indicate the center of each cluster. We apply this convolution to each point and create a new 3D space in which the dataset has a certain property that we want to be linear separable. Therefore, the method we are proposed to learn features from image markers is based on this idea. Only we have images. Let's take a look at how a method to learn feature structures from image markers works. Let X be a dataset of images. We have images of the blue class and the green class. We need to draw markers on those images in regions that we think are relevant. But, as an image classification problem can have many training images, placing markers on all our images would be a prohibitive job since the user must do it. So, we use a projection to select images that we are going to place markers on. This projection maps images that are points in high-dimensional space to a 2D space that we can visualize. Through projection, we can identify groups of images that are similar. And then, we select some of those images to place markers because it must have good features to identify images close to it. After selecting the images, we add markers and then use them to learn feature structures. Let's take a look at the convolution operation again. We have a kernel sliding through an image, and for each pixel, the convolution operation is the dot product between the kernel's feature vector and the pixel's feature vector, which includes neighbor pixels. If the kernel is good for identifying the image class, blue in this case, it must produce positive activations in regions that are important to discriminate this class from the other ones. If we take regions of that image and use them as kernels, we can produce kernels that are effective for filtering useful features to identify images of the blue class. To do this, we draw markers in regions that we think are important to identifying the class. We take a patch around markers pixels. Those patches can overlap. We must do this for the other classes as well. We can do this for several images, and now we have a large number of candidates kernels. Each of these candidates can have several channels, and as we don't want to learn a bias for this convolution, we have to perform a normalization that we call marker-based normalization, in which we learn the dataset's average and standard deviation per channel based on the patches that have been labeled. Then, we centralize and standardize an image using this information. To choose which patches will be the kernels we use for convolution, we cluster these patches and take the centers of the clusters. The dot product between each point in that group and its center must produce positive results for that group and negative results for points of other groups. Then we can use the group center as kernels for convolution. In this way, the kernels of each group are responsible for identifying features of these groups, and thus we can use them as filters to find these features in the dataset images. The whole process can be summarized in these steps. Start patches from around markers, cluster those patches, and apply the convolutional layer. We can repeat this process for several layers using the output from the previous layer to learn the filters of the next one, taking care to not use a strider greater than 1 so that we can preserve the location of the markers. To apply fling to some problem, one can follow these steps. Get a projection to select images, draw markers, and apply fling to build a feature structure. To evaluate our method, we applied it to a problem of classifying images of coconut trees. We have aerial images made by drones from regions where there are coconut tree plantations. These images are divided into 90 by 90 patches, and we want to identify which patches of these images have a coconut tree or not. These are the two classes of the problem. This problem is relevant for regions where coconut tree plantations are a considerable part of the local economy. It is important to keep track of these plantations over time, checking the extent and number of trees, for example. This work is tedious and error-prone when done by a human, so it would be interesting to have an automatic method to do this. The entire set of imaging has 13,587 patches of 19 by 19 with a 80 centimeters spatial resolution, 10,268 of coconut tree images, and 3,319 of non-coconut tree images. We used 200 images of training set and 11,377 images for the test set. The idea of such a small training set is that we believe that our method does not require a larger number of labeled images for training. We selected 4 images to place markers, 2 for the coconut tree class and 2 for the non-coconut tree class. We made this division between training set and test set 3 times and repeated the same experiments also 3 times. We took the mean and standard deviation of the metrics. This is the architecture of the feature structure that we built using Flim. The feature structure has only one layer that consists of a convolutional operation, an activation function, and a max pooling operation. Convolution uses stride 1, but pooling uses stride 4. For classifier, we tested 2 options, an MLP classifier with this architecture and an SVM classifier. We then consider the following scenarios. The feature structure learned from Flim with an SVM classifier. The feature structure learned from Flim with a multilayer perceptron classifier. The feature structure learned from Flim with a multilayer perceptron classifier, and we adjusted the structure using backpropagation. We trained the feature structure and the classifier from scratch using backpropagation. As a baseline, we use a very famous network, WTD. We consider the following scenarios. We trained WTD from scratch using only 200 images. We fine-tuned WTD pre-trained with ImageNet. We use the WTD feature structure with the weights from ImageNet and exchange the classifier for an SVM. Results using precision recall and F-score can be seen here. Note that the feature structure learned with Flim with an MRP classifier was tied technically with the WTD fine-tuned with the weights from ImageNet. But note that WTD is a much more complex network with many more parameters and trained with a much larger number of images. If we increase the number of images to train, we see that this result remains. Increasing the set of images in which we place markers does not worsen the results, and the result remains. Now, let's take a look at some examples of misclassified images. Can you tell which one does not contain a coconut tree? In these images, coconut trees appear in different angles, size, and shape, or the boundaries between the coconut tree and the background are tenuous, making it more difficult to identify them. In turn, images that do not contain coconut trees contain trees that resemble their shape. Identifying coconut trees in those images can be challenging. Thanks for watching. The link for the paper is in the description.